Buenas tardes y bienvenidos al evento El Futuro del
Good
Trabajo.
afternoon and welcome to the event of the future. We apologize. It took a while to start.
For you, those of you who are English speakers, you can access interpretation by pressing the globe button that says interpretation below, and you will get interpretation into English of our event today. Bueno, otra vez, gracias por asistir a este evento. Yo soy John.
Again, thank you for being here. I'm John Semko. I am the director for Latin America and the Caribbean of the International Center for Private Enterprises. And with pleasure, I will introduce the two panelists that we have for this event. This event, The Future of Work, is part of a series of events that we are presenting in CIEN for dialogue and information and new ideas on how to leave the pandemics and how we can start again. In order to look for the challenges of the region, the different challenges there are. Today, we'll introduce the two panelists very briefly. We will send a link on the chat room with the bios for both of them. Each will have 20 minutes, and then we will start the Q&A. And I will ask you to please send your Q&A in the chat room so that we can present the questions to the presenters. Okay, first I will introduce David Casasola, who is an investigator in CIEN, which is an investigation center that is quite important in Guatemala. He has a lot of expertise on these issues, unemployment and labor issues in Guatemala. And later, we will hear Luis Oscar Estrada, who is the admin manager of JFX. Which is the Association of Enterprises that represents the textile and clothing industry in Guatemala. He also has about 25 years of experience on this, and he's our Minister of Economy of Guatemala. Okay, so I will hand this over to David directly so that he can mention some of the works he's done, and then Luis Oscar. So David, you're on. Thank you for the presentation, Joe. I hope that we can... I'll present the agenda. I hope to use the next 20 minutes I have. First of all, I want to emphasize what the challenges were that Guatemala had, especially in labor and COVID, and how the challenges have grown. At the end, I will mention some of the thoughts that we have through different projects, and part of them, of course, we've been supported by CIEN, and they have been, and we've been able to place these issues to the authorities so they could look at the different alternatives. If we look at the limited opportunities of the formal labor, I want to show you how the blue line evolves in the amount of people that are looking for opportunities for formal work, that, as you can see, since 2012 to 2019, it has been increasing. This amount of people has been increasing. And in the red line, you have the total available slots or formal jobs. The difference that there is between the blue line and the red line, I call the gap, which is the line that you can see in the gray color there. It has a clear behavior. I mean, it's clearly going up. You can notice that there is a positive trend. And before COVID-19, That was the Guatemalan situation. The opportunities were growing, but it wasn't sufficient because we have a young population and there's young people looking for economic opportunities and wages, and obviously this line, this blue line that you see here, will always have a positive trend. It will always be moving forward or upwards. Now, we are concerned because since 2012 to date, or before to the pandemics, the growth has been very limited. And then we will reflect why. And you may ask, well, what happens with that gap? What are you doing about it? Or what do 3 million people, almost 3 million people who need work do? And why don't they go through formal employment? Well, there's two escape valves. First, there's irregular immigration towards the U.S., and that explains why Guatemala in the last year has depended so much on remittances from abroad. We have a huge population that is looking for opportunities, and they see in the U.S. an opportunity of generating wealth, and they decide to risk their life to move to the U.S. The second thing, as we can see in the next chart, is they end up doing what in Guatemala is the exception and not the rule. Informal activities, as you can see in this blue line, we've got the total population, the total informal population with regards to the total population that is occupied. As you can notice, almost 7 of every 10 people in Guatemala are employed in an informal activity, and that's where the challenges come. This is not only during the pandemics or before the pandemics, but also now after the pandemics. The economy has a lot of branches and a lot of informality, and what that ends up doing is there's a very small tax base. If we need to have more income for public policies, and the base on which we can collect taxes is limited because the activities, the financial activities, especially in times of pandemics, tend to become informal. And in the case of Guatemala, this is something very common, even before the pandemics. Almost 70% of the population is informally, or they have informal activities, and you can see this growing line, this red line. People move over to the informal activities. And at the end of the day, that's the type of information that we look at and to understand the challenges we have. Another thing that sets the base or the conditions for the labor market in Guatemala is that we have a divorce or a separation between the policies or the instruments to generate the right economic conditions for better employment opportunities, and then the reality of the income of the people. Here, as an example, is the minimum wage. In Guatemala, the minimum wage is set annually, and it's checked annually, and then they decide what to do. And as you can see in this graph, since 2002 to last year, the minimum wage has obviously been increasing, but the income of the population has not had the same behavior. As you can, if it's people that have full-time jobs in Guatemala, this is 40 hours a week. To those that work for daily wages, they have an income of about around 1,000 quetzals. This is around 120, 130 US dollars a month. And this has not changed throughout time. As you can see, this line that is purple and the red one, there's a minimum wage in the farms. We see that we have not managed to set the conditions for more production. That's the type of concern we have, because I know we're talking about the future of work, and a lot of people who hear us in different countries may be witnesses of the progress of technology. Now, there are bots, there are machines, and it's many times answering a question or providing assistance, and that's the trend. That's a future of technology, and that's a reality. But if we look at an economy like the Guatemalan economy, the challenges that we have are huge, and we are not even there yet. We're not even thinking, how do we adapt to technology? We're still just trying to be more have more people in the formal economy, or how to set the right conditions for coherence and coordination between the reality of the workers and the public policies. So most of the workers in Guatemala have low wages. Here, these are the different, we've divided the population between 20%. So 25% of the population in Guatemala in 2019 had an income of 407 quetzals. That's about $50. So 25% of the population of Guatemala only makes $50 a month to provide all of the needs for their families. And 60% of the population had incomes of 1,800 quetzals. That is about $250, $225 a month. So in very general terms, we have a population that today has low wages, low income. And when we check what they do for a living, most of them are involved in agriculture or farming. They use their strength, they use some tools, whatever tools they have at hand. They farm the lands in order to produce and generate their wages. At the end of the day, what that shows us is that the transition of the country will be deeper, and where we are only talking about generating attractive conditions, and we're realizing that the life conditions of the population, of the workforce, are conditions where the incomes are low, so it's hard for them to expect them to use that the little money they make to train or to learn or to go to school, because they have to cover their basic living expenses. And today, they are in sectors where it's hard to transition. So they learn specific things of the trade, but they are too tied up to specific activity. And to end this part of before COVID, I'm going to move on faster. What I want to show you here is the different regions of Guatemala, how what the average years of formal education are. Before we talk about soft skills or skills to innovate, per se, Guatemala, or the employed population, has less and less incentives to go to school or to stay in school, for many reasons that have to do with the tax burden, or excuse me, the burden that they have as of a small age, the little opportunities for studies, the high cost of education. The first 6 years of education are free, but by 2019, we basically had, just in the Department of Guatemala, there were populations that had, on average, education level that was almost close to finishing elementary. They were almost close to finishing 9 years of education. The rest of those people, especially in the rural areas, had that the average of the population that is working there doesn't even finish their elementary education. So in general, because and I want to move forward now to talk about the impact of COVID. COVID, in general, is increased what it did is increased the uncertainty And when there's uncertainty, people do not invest. And in Guatemala, all of the measures that were taken as of March produced a drop in the economic activity. We still don't have enough information or facts to talk about the impact. But what we can say, or what we are witnesses to, is the huge drop in the economic activity in the last 30 years of the economic history of the country. And well, at the end, there's so much more poverty, and there is a decrease in the quality of life. It will take a couple of years before we can gather the information and mention quality of life. But the numbers that are available here, we see a historical drop of almost 2 digits in the economy monthly for almost 3 months. And the loss of jobs, or formal jobs, there was a small growth in the public sector because there was a need to employ more people because of COVID, but there's a drop of almost 80,000 jobs. Before this, annually, Guatemala was generating about 10,000 jobs per year. So we lost between January and September, in 8 months, we lost the employment that we generated, or the new employment that we generated in almost 8 years. So that is the impact that we have right now. Besides the challenges I mentioned before, we have 80,000 people who will try to figure out a way of generating income outside the formal market where they were. In order to close this part, obviously, COVID and many of the elements, see, we're not very competitive in Guatemala, and we don't have the best conditions we don't have the best climate environment. So it will be hard to expect that we will solve this. Guatemala doesn't have bankruptcy law, and many companies were not able to soften their falls during COVID. There was no legal framework, no conducive legal framework for this. The judiciary body in Guatemala had several months of closing in the pandemic, so we would have to see what the World Bank says. But in very general terms, the conditions to do business have receded. And so what recommendations or what final reflections do we have in this context that, of course, we can talk more in the next phase of this webinar? I think that we need, not only because of COVID, but because of the progress in technology, we have to have better regulation. We have been very slow in evolving our regulations. And a sample of this is that during COVID, different schemes of hiring, such as hourly rates and teleworking, didn't have anything written in the law. So it's very important to set things straight and to have a regulatory framework, not only for the pandemics, but that can be adapted and we have to get ready for the future. The road to formality is important. We still don't have all of the tools for people just to start a normal business in Guatemala, and 60%, as we said, is involved in informal activities. In this case, as I was mentioning, that's what we need. We need adaptability. I will wrap up my presentation, but it's very important to give better tools to the people. As you were able to realize, we have groups of the population that haven't even finished the 6 mandatory years of elementary education. And if we aspire to have better education levels in Guatemala, what we have to make sure of is that while children are in school, those years that they're in school, they should get the tools they really need to be able to be successful and to strive in life and to adapt to the new trends and the new technology and the soft skills that are usually not non-existent in the traditional education systems that have that are just not up to date. Also, it's very important that there's not the separation in the school between the academics and the companies, because at the end of the day, the companies ask for many skills that are not being taught in the educational centers. So then they double efforts, and the people who are in charge of developing, at the absence of these skills in the educational centers and the abilities with which. And finally, we do think it's very important that this gap that I mentioned in the beginning of the employment and the drop could be worked with through a transformation strategy, where we have to, in some way, have the right incentives so that there can be economic activities with added value. And that will start with, if we have the right pillars set so that we can have a better industrialization of the economy and a better capacity through investments and the productive sectors, there's intensive productive sectors. So with this, I'm done because I know that I am running out of time, and I thank you for the space. Thank you, David. It was a very interesting presentation. Okay, I will hand over the mic to Luis Oscar Estrada so that he can give us some comments and other comments. Luis Carlos, or Luis Oscar, sorry, has the mic. Thank you. First of all, I want to thank you for the opportunity that you give me to be able to share with you, share the comments on the future of work. And we've been working on some projects together where we agree in many things on the labor market. I structured some comments. First of all, what has happened? And then the situation in the labor market, on the future of work, and some recommendations that I have for the companies, for the workers, for the government authorities of Guatemala, that can be up, and all this can be applicable to other countries. And at the end, well, my final reflections. Okay. I have 31 years of experience in the private sector and 4 years of public sector experience, and something like this had never happened before. The world changed. 1 year ago, we were thinking, we had many plans ahead and the labor part and the personal part, but suddenly the pandemics hit, and I don't think our generation ever saw something like this. So everything changed, as I just said. We started being afraid. We started being worried, anxious. We didn't want to leave the house. Started being insecure, especially in the labor market, where if we depend on a salary, if we depend on a company and we see that the company's not doing well, we start to be very worried. And I think that that affected a lot of people. In our case, I work in an industry where we were very affected because there was a lot of people working in the factories, and people started to be very afraid because they didn't want to catch the virus. So the only way to overcome the fear was to train them a lot, to believe in the protocols, and that helped us adapt to a different world. The companies or those that work in the offices, it was easy for us. We just went back home, and now we sit at home or in the office. We have a meeting. We don't have to move or drive anywhere. It was comfortable. It was nice being able to stay at home. But the people that had to produce or provide services, well, for them it was a challenge because it was important. I mean, how do you get your workers to the workplace safely, and how can you make sure that the workplace is safe? So there was a lot of change in the labor market. Today I had lunch with the general director of export, which is the entity of exporters, and he said, look, imagine how difficult it was for me to have to fire people. And it was a lot of jobs because many places, when you cut back on the budgets, you have to sadly have some people leave, and also adjust wages and schedules, cut back on people as well as hours. So from my point of view, what happened? Well, the labor market changed. Moving from one place to another has been, I mean, we've been limited. And in our case, if we have a car, then we're all right. But in the case of people or workers or people who work in the informal economy, moving and not having public transport, well, I'm sure that affects their economy a lot. Also, or David, sorry, was giving us information about how the private sector reduced their contracts and how the public sector grew. And that's bad, because if the government employs more people, this is not good, because the government doesn't generate wealth. The government uses the wealth that we generate. So I do see this as, I mean, I am concerned because we have to, David was showing some numbers of a negative scale of people leaving, people coming in. Okay, the jobs that were created by the government, but that is not good. So the having changed the way we work, I spent about a month and a half at home. How nice. I stayed at home. I just put a nice shirt on just in case I had a meeting, so it looked like I was all dressed up, but I was just in shorts, comfortable shoes. I managed my time, and I was responsible. I had to make sure that I used my time wisely. So, but that changed. And for the companies to have people at home was also very nice, because there's savings. A lot of offices were emptied. And in Guatemala, you'll see many office spaces for rent now or available. A lot of companies had to telework, and they just left the offices and stopped paying rent. And the workers, in many places, well, the workers suffered a lot of issues. First of all, longer hours. Number two, a reduction in salaries in some cases. Number three, the concern of what will happen tomorrow. So there was a lot of concern in the workers of what would happen if, do I go back to work or not? Will they fire me? Because obviously the companies were not doing well. And who was ready a year ago, or when the pandemic struck in Guatemala, as David was saying? We have very high workloads, and many companies have this provision in books, but they don't have that cash in the provisions. So they haven't really provisioned. So there started being a lot of issues and problems. And after 9 months, we see that the labor market has changed a lot. We adapted to a system that is different. The telework system in the companies that provide services, well, it was easier because we were able to adapt. But the workers that go to a production plant, well, for them it was harder, because they had to move using public transport, and if they didn't, they would get late, and the companies would not let them come to work because they showed up later. They would cut back on the hours, and all of this caused a lot of stress in the labor market. All of this led to something that David is passionate about, it's entrepreneurship. A lot of entrepreneurs came up. Entrepreneurs because of need, most of them obviously, and others because of vocation. And many people who were fired from their jobs. In Guatemala, there's a system that for every year that I work, I have one salary as part of what I pay into the system. And so a lot of people started generating their own business. And all these small businesses, in some cases, became businesses. Like from where I lived, I would start doing a product and sell it, and then I would start experimenting with that to have a, just for subsistence. But those circles are ending, and maybe they'll try the product once or to help you, or they didn't like it and they didn't buy it again. So that will end soon. That's what I saw in the pandemics. And from my personal experience, I have 2 daughters. Just to give you an example, one worked in a company and she said, "Daddy, I'm quitting because my job, well, they cut my salary by 40%. I have to work more hours and Saturdays and Sundays. And with what I've already learned, I'm going to start working on my own. And I think it'll be better to work on my own than to continue doing it with the company where I am, because I don't think that the company will do any better. I will work 3 months more for them to look for someone to replace me." This is a real situation. Luckily, well, she had a home, she had food, she had security, safety. She didn't have an urgency to look elsewhere. But like that, there's many cases that with the pandemics, and it's good to look at the past, and it's good to reflect on the past. As I said, I saw a lot of fear in people, concern, panic, people who lost their homes because they weren't able to pay the bank, or they had to return the cars, they couldn't pay, and there was a lot of domestic violence because having to be with your spouse all day, it's not easy, especially when relations are not good. In the case of Guatemala, there's a lot of family violence, and so I just wanted to give this as an introduction of how I see what happened. The labor market and COVID, well, like I said, many companies reduced their personnel. There was a lot of negotiations in companies. I was witness to this. We have where I work, we have an office space where we could mediate for the companies to be able to reach agreements with the workers for their salaries and compensations and how to reach agreements, so without having legal issues in the future. And all of this also, well, we saw a reduction in the contracts. We saw how many companies, in the case of our government, had, or Congress in Guatemala approved a law in which it gave the workers, or it had the workers declare that if the companies said we cannot longer pay for employees, well, they would give them $10 a day for those employees. So like $300 a month, that the people could, if the company declared this, they could obtain this money. This fund took 4 months to come into action. Many employees used it, and it was a bit of oxygen for many companies. And it allowed the companies to at least pay a wage. That was for a worker. So a worker has a minimum wage of a day, it's about 130 quetzales. So this was 75 quetzales. Well, it would cover some of their expenses, but I know many cases where executives of companies were benefited from this fund because the companies could no longer pay them their salaries. So this fund ended in October, and now the companies have to rehire the people. In Guatemala, there's two types of additional service provision. One or another salaries. There's a salary, 14th salary in July, and in December, the 15th salary. So imagine companies that paid this 14th salary in July with no work. Then they had to pay another salary in December. So it's a big blow. It's two salaries instead of one in December. So I'm sure that now there's going to be a lot of labor issues because the companies really don't have the cash to cover this. And as David was mentioning, informality is what a lot of people get into. So many companies hire people without contracts or legally or per day because there's no partial work law in Guatemala. And the partial labor law would allow the companies to hire people per hour and pay them for what they do. I mean, like it's done in the US. Because if not, we have very high liabilities. A lot of people in the labor part, they don't leave from one job to the next because they're waiting for their time of service. And the companies don't fire them because they don't have the money to do so, or they're waiting for them to quit so they don't have to pay them. So in the labor market, that's what's going on. And what David was mentioning about the loss of jobs, I see that the Social Security of Guatemala reported that 110 people stopped. Oh, excuse me, 110,000 people lost their jobs or stopped paying into the Social Security. What does this mean? This means that many companies are delayed with paying the Social Security. And this is dangerous because if somebody doesn't pay Social Security, they might not be covered. I have 35 years of paying into the Social Security system. 35 times 12, we're talking about 350 plus 70, it's 420. It's 420 months that I've paid into. I already surpassed, but I'm still not 60. So because I'm still not 60, I still have to pay into the system. When I'm 60, I will have the right to request the institute to give me a pension fund. This pension fund will be about $800 a month. So it's very important. It's not so much about the value of the pension, but they do have medical coverage and you can get medical coverage. Obviously, when you get older, you start getting sick, and the Social Security in Guatemala does have good coverage. So what I was mentioning, that the concern of I am concerned because the government has hired a lot of people. That doesn't make me happy. What do I recommend? Well, going into conclusions or recommendations, I have 3 recommendations for companies. I think it's very important that the companies check the labor conditions, and now that they're working at home, because in Guatemala there's no law about work from home. So it's important that there could be conditions set in the labor contracts. I think that the companies, or one of their strengths, has to be keeping the health protocols for the staff. It's important to have protocols for that the offices or office space has to have the right conditions. that the responsibility campaigns to raise awareness in the workers on how to take care of themselves within and without the companies. In Guatemala, there's been a lot of COVID cases now because there's a lot of parties and it's the end of the year, and people meet and they give each other presents and they hug and they kiss, and well, this this could bring a COVID peak like we saw in the US. We're still waiting for the results of Thanksgiving or what could have happened with all those spreading of the virus. And another recommendation for the companies is that they provide kits to their workers. In our case, as an office, we have some kits, basic kits, for any symptom that they may have, that he can go to a doctor and really start taking medication to prevent if there are any COVID symptoms. For workers, my recommendations are to pay attention to what the government is asking us to obey. We have to understand how important it is to abide and to. Every company has its own norms. The use of face masks is very important. We use face masks here. We all have a bottle of alcohol. We use it often, frequently. And another thing that I find very important, this taught us that we have to have new competences, new skills. I'll talk about my generation or my person. Adapting to a system of communications like this. The beginning was very hard for me because you're used to saying hello to someone and shaking hands and looking into their eyes to have contact, and now we don't. Now it's all at a distance. Technology. We that are from a generation like mine, it has been hard to adapt. And the world has changed. And if we still have an opportunity to continue working, I think it's very important to adapt to the new trends. I always thought that labor competences are very important and education, but some people have many degrees and masters, but they don't have a job because all they've done is study and never put what they studied into practice. And I'm saying this because I know a lot of people in Guatemala who are like this, and it's more important that we strengthen our job skills, because in Latin America we have many skills, many abilities, and if we only perfect them, they can help increase our level and our competitiveness and better incomes. It's also important not to be afraid to change different labor dynamics. And I mentioned about the meetings, we have to be resilient, and there's a lot of jobs that will disappear, like secretaries. We almost have no more secretaries. If you look at the banks today, it's all e-banking. We don't make lines in banks anymore. Now you can cash a check online or move money from one account to the next. It's not like before where we physically had to go to the bank. All this has changed, so many jobs have disappeared. In the case of Guatemala, with the newspapers used to be 80, 90 pages long, and now they're only 15 pages long. Ink is no longer a business. Everything is digital. So we have to adapt to that change. That's why it's so important that we have to think that it's never too late to start learning. I always tell this story, and I'm not ashamed to share this. My mother, rest in peace, she was a farmer, but a very smart lady. She was a businesswoman, and at 52, she said, "I don't want to die without being poor." And at 52, she would go to night school, and she finished 6th grade elementary school. And when she finished, I mean, I still have that diploma. For me, it's very special. And she gave it to me and she said, look, I told you I didn't want to die being a nobody. I learned many things at an old age, and I always use her as an example. It's never too late to learn. Sometimes we think we know it all, and it's hard to adapt to change. And we don't like to learn because we think that we know everything. And to wrap up, sorry, because I'm running late, but to the authorities of the government, well, it's very important that they enable entrepreneurship. As David was mentioning, it's very hard to motivate companies. When we talk about motivations and incentives, they think that it's privileges, but it's not really privileges. It's very different. There's programs like My First Job that worked 6 years ago, a program in which the government gave you a subsidy to people with no experience to be able to work in a company. And there was a subsidy of 6 months, and this allowed them to gain experience, because now we see that they say we need people with experience. But what if they never worked? Then they don't have any experience. And for the companies, it's hard to train people because that requires an investment. So there has to be a mix between companies and the public sector to be able to include programs. David talked about the flexibility. And also it's important to mention, I always calling it tying the demands with the training centers, or pairing them up, actually. We have to define as a country, it's very hard, every 4 years we have to change the government. We have to be attractive, efficient, and get ready for that. We have to have the right staff that is trained to be able to offer, or to be attractive for investment. Now call centers there's a lot of demand for call centers for people who speak English. But in Guatemala, we don't have enough people who speak English. So we have to train them to attract investment. Finally, well, with this I'll end. 9 months ago, we felt at ease, we felt comfortable, we thought we had everything well planned out for this year. Pandemics has changed everything. It has forced us to become more creative, more productive, to befriend technology, like I mentioned, and to value and treasure everything we have. Maybe before we didn't realize we had it. We had a lot. And pandemics opened our eyes. It's important not to fear change and to never stop learning. That's it. Thank you so much for inviting me. And if there's any questions or anything you need to know, I'm here. Thank you, Luis Oscar. Well, since we started a bit late, I will extend for Q&A. If there's any questions, please ask them. I will start with the first question, and in part, this is from the comment of Luis Oscar, that we shouldn't fear change. For me, it's clear that there are some challenges within the pandemics that are very specific to the pandemics and are very hard, but other issues are long-term challenges in country. And I'm not talking about just Guatemala, but all of Latin America. Issues such as the size of the sector, of the informal sector, that is very large, or the lack of education that talks about the needs of the private sector. So there is a possibility of using these pandemics issues so that we're not afraid of the future, to request and encourage changes in public policies to solve some of these challenges. I'm just asking both panelists. Thank you, John. I'll start, and then Luis Oscar I'm sure will want to add something. I think that we have to take advantage of the need of COVID to not just, to encourage digital, not to avoid paperwork and to try to become more digital. The government has tried to ease some paperwork, some red tape that had to avoid contact between people. Now they are digital. But I think that even before, we do need to look at everything deeply because there's an overregulation in many situations in Guatemala. So there's too many steps in order to, for example, close a deal or to change how a company is set up, or from those that go from informality to formality. How do you declare taxes? How do you do the counting, et cetera, et cetera? It's complex. So I think that besides this big leap to the digital and electronics, I think that before this, we do need a process of simplifying this, especially to understand what the informal sector would represent, to be able to give that big leap towards formalization. I don't know if Luis Oscar wants to add something. Many laws are issued or passed. Many bills are passed, but they are not applicable. There's a law of entrepreneurship now. It's been a year now that it's been passed, but the entrepreneurship law is good. But how applicable is it? The biggest burden an entrepreneur has is financing. No bank will ever give him money. No bank will risk his or her capital because there are no guarantees that this person who will take out a loan can have any credit record. It's like for the first job thing. I graduated from high school, and a high school student has no skills. He's just ready for college, but I couldn't get a job because I wasn't an accountant, I wasn't a teacher, I wasn't a secretary. So it's very hard for me because I didn't have, or what I studied was not applicable. Same thing happens with the laws. This entrepreneurship law has many benefits, many incentives, but how many people have adapted? Very few, because there are no facilities for credit. There is no way to set up a company. David mentioned this. We go into the world now and it's all digital, but then I still have to physically go and get a piece of paper and waste time and ask for a date. I get the date and then I have to be there physically half an hour before so I don't lose my turn. So why is it electronic? I think we still have a lot ahead in public policies. We have a Congress that is too distant from reality. We have a Congress that does not legislate to benefit an economic agenda. We have pandemics, but the Congress has not enacted or passed one law for economic reactivation. In the US, when there's a problem, what does the US do? They develop laws to reactivate the economy, focused at generating jobs, generating investment. But here, we're far from that. Instead of incentivizing production, we're scaring it away. There's no incentives law. Who will come to invest in a country where there's no incentives? If I have to start paying taxes from day one. So I think it's very important that we can achieve, or we can have Congress next year work a lot in a legislative agenda to create a regulatory framework for Guatemala. I don't know if we've answered your question. Yes, thank you. We have a question on the impact of the pandemics in entrepreneur women and women in general in Guatemala. Do you have any information or anything on this? we still don't have updated and microeconomic information. The National Census or Statistics Bureau hasn't done the polls and surveys it usually does. So they haven't given us any info. But what I could say about this is that it's becoming harder and harder to close the gaps that there were before pandemics. And besides men and women, we have to think about the people living in the rural areas, people that are in places where there are no opportunities. We still don't have updated information. Luis Oscar mentioned that there is more family violence, but we still don't have facts.
Luis Oscar, ¿tiene algún comentario al respecto?
Luis Oscar, do you have any comment about this? No, I don't have any info because it's not what I do, but what I do know is that there wasn't a positive impact in many people that became entrepreneurs. How many of these have become part of the formal economy? Well, we'd have to see in the official numbers and statistics. But if they've not become formal, it will be important to be able to measure, because many people, when they're at home, they started carrying out an activity. And so what I can say is that a lot of new businesses arose. How many of them are formal? Well, we'd have to see in the statistics in Guatemala. And sure, we can follow this up, and through David, maybe we can share the information. Thank you. We have some comments, some final comments to wrap up. Issues like comments on the possibility of allowing more hourly work or getting rid of minimum wage or keeping it as it is. I don't know if you have any comments about this type of norms for work. Minimum wage, well, I had this in my notes, but I didn't mention it. For me, minimum wage is a burden for the worker because it's a limit. What I mentioned of the workload, it was about 41.76%. And most of the companies hire a worker with minimum wage so that the expenses are not too high. So somebody who makes 10,000 quetzals is paid on the minimum wage, which is 2,000 or 3,000 that they have to for medical coverage and stuff, and the pension fund. So that has affected the labor market in Guatemala because they are punishing people by setting a minimum salary. I'll give you another example. I work in the textile industry, and I work with the maquila law. Somebody who sews makes a minimum wage. He's making a shirt, he's in the production cycle, but somebody who's packing the shirts or is cutting or is folding makes the same wage. The difference many times in some companies is the incentives. But today that we are paying a 13th salary on December 15th, I'm not saying that the guy who folds the shirts is not doing, but both of them will make the same 15th salary. And the partial work or the hourly rate is very important because in Guatemala, there's a satanic war against this, against partial or hourly hours, hourly wages, because people think they will make less money, but they will actually make more money. People will be able to have 2 employees in the same day, and that's what the labor sectors in Guatemala, or the unions, don't see this.
Muy bien, David. ¿Tiene algo para terminar en este tema?
Claro, yo quiero cerrar esas
I want to
reflexiones
close
hablando acerca de
by saying or talking about the impact
muchas decisiones
that a lot of decisions have in Guatemala. It's a lot of decisions that are taken by inertia.
es una aplicación que
Minimum wage is something that by law is done annually.
en ocasiones cuando se aborda el tema
And when we cover this, we forget the goal, the objective. And if we see the labor conditions in general, not just in the formal markets, because the formal market,
aunque cada vez son menos,
even though there's fewer jobs, are in conditions or they have more favorable conditions. When we see the formal market, we see the whole picture, we see that we are falling behind in producing conditions to make all the workers more productive, and especially to make sure that as technology advances and there's innovation, that they can gain experience instead of being fired from whatever job they have now. So I think that if we have a more clear picture, then we do see that the way in the minimum wage is set, we're falling behind. And just setting the minimum wage is not a policy. We need other instruments in order to assure this.
Muy bien, gracias.
Okay, thank you. I just want to add something about the salary. In Guatemala, the salary is negotiated between the employee, the workers, and the government. So at the end of the day, the president decides if there will be a salary increase or not. Based on what? Based on emotions many times and with no technical criteria.
Muy bien, gracias.
Thank you. Okay, before we finish, because we're running late, I want to invite the participants and everybody who's listening in on this event. I want to encourage them to follow us for future events. We will continue in the new year. We'll continue with these issues about the future of work. And in the chat room, you can see how to follow us and to be notified, to get notifications of events in the future. I want to thank our both panelists for being here today, for this interesting dialogue that we shared, and for their contributions to try to find solutions to these issues. Pandemics has placed challenges in front of us, big challenges, and we hope that we, on behalf of CIPE, that we can look for solutions through dialogue and for others in the future. Thank you to you both, David and Luis Oscar Estrada, for your participation today. Thanks everybody for listening in. Happy New Year. Happy New Year. Bye.